Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk about the death of jazz. Before I get into that, I do have a Kickstarter for my latest book, King Leper. That's Eternal Dream Book 3. You could find the link down below in the description box and read about that. There'll be some hand-signed copies available for you to order, as well as ones that aren't, if those sell out by the time that you see this video, which I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I think I've already funded, so that's good. Anyway, let's start with this Miles Davis quote. I never thought that the music called jazz was ever meant to reach just a small group of people or become a museum thing locked under glass like all the other dead things that were once considered artistic. I believe he said this in the 1980s, which would be towards the end of his life and career. And also, unfortunately, he's describing what I'm going to talk about in this video, which is that jazz as a style, jazz as a cultural product was already being turned into something that isn't culturally relevant anymore, something that isn't living anymore, and something that is a kind of a dead, preserved product, kind of like, 19th century folk dancing or something like that, though with a little bit more diverse history, obviously, in the case of jazz. So what I want to talk about is not just jazz, but this series of things that happen to any cultural product that take it from a living, breathing, evolving, and relevant thing and turn it into a preserved, dead, and irrelevant thing. There's a couple of phases that I'll talk about, just kind of like how I talk about like the phases of corporate IP death. So the first phase is birth, right? And in the case of any style, whether it's like jazz or it's metal or it's even disco or something like that, it usually happens in a particular place and a particular time and is done by particular people. That is, for instance, with, British prog rock, it's a bunch of British musicians who kind of knew each other and played in the same areas and saw each other play. And so they influence each other. They pick up stylistic elements from each other. They slowly start to develop a coherent language in the art that they're creating that makes sense, and it's mostly made for each other. It's made for themselves, kind of like flamenco. Flamenco is originally made by and for a certain group of people, and only later gets kind of exported. So it starts in a scene. A scene is a good way of putting it. Phase 2 is the growth scene, the growth part, and it kind of overspills that original birthplace and becomes something a little bit more popular, and it starts to attract people who aren't from that time and that place where it begins, but are still attracted to and interested in that art. And you start to have like a little subculture develop. Think of stuff, if you're not going to think about jazz, this really started to happen in the 1910s into the 1920s, is you start to have this grow into a thing that is itself an idea of jazz as a style. If you want to think outside of jazz, you can have the development of punk rock in the 1970s in particular scenes, and then it starts to become an actual pop culture phenomenon, or heavy metal, or any of the styles that you might think about evolving like out of the 60s and 70s. Because it's not just about jazz. Jazz is just a great example of this, and I think where a lot of styles may end up going. Phase 3 is the popularity. This is where it becomes a pop culture phenomenon. It becomes an actual cultural force that is mainstream. At a certain point, jazz was the mainstream art form for a lot of young people, especially in American culture. Swing music was the dominant and most popular form of music, with guys like Benny Goodman in the 1940s. And if you look at it, you look at Benny Goodman, he's a white musician. And so right away you have something that's a little bit different from the scene that created and grew jazz in the 1920s, which was predominantly African. You have white musicians who are really popularizing it. And at that point you have the height of the style. And what you end up with in phase 4 is a recapture, which is where the people who are kind of the hardcore fans, the aficionados, the fanatics of the style, start to create sub-styles and subcultures that recapture this style and internalize it and make it more inwardly focused. So in the case of jazz, this was the bebop revolution. So as a reaction to big band stuff in the 40s, you had bebop. Bebop actually goes back further than that, because big bands also go back further than that. It's small groups. It's groups that are playing really complex chord changes. They're playing very fast. They're playing for each other, or they're playing for a really knowledgeable audience that happens to know a lot about jazz and is really familiar with the improvisational language of jazz. Bebop, for somebody who's never listened to it before, may find it kind of impenetrable. If you go back and listen to Charlie Parker or Dizzy Gillespie or even Miles Davis with the hard bop stuff. And so hard bop would be like the next evolution of that, being extra bop, even more bop, something like Giant Steps by John Coltrane. Giant Steps is a great record, but for people who have never heard jazz before, it's going to sound incomprehensible. It's going to sound like just these sheets of notes and all this noodling. And that's where you get the recapture of the style. The style becomes more inwardly focused and it becomes more about itself once again. So it gets taken away from a larger group of people, and the inner circle starts to try to distill the essence of the art and breathe new life into it and create barriers to entry so that normies can't get in, normies can't pollute it, so that casual people can't enjoy it. And bebop is a great example of that. Hard bop is a great example of that. Free jazz, as you continue to have different styles progress, where they are almost hostile to people who aren't really steeped in the language of jazz. If you want to think of a more contemporary example, it would be like death metal. Okay, death metal and black metal evolving in the 1990s. Death metal and black metal, black metal, according to Varg Vikernes, is really anti-death metal, and he says that in a couple of his books, is that it's a reaction against death metal. Everyone wanted to sound like Morbid Angel, and I wanted to go the opposite direction. But even then, Morbid Angel, a lot of the thrash stuff in the 80s is a reaction to the more popularized, the big style of kind of hair metal that was popular in the 80s, right? We're going to be Morbid Angel, we're going to be Cannibal Corpse because we're not Rat, we're not Skid Row, we're not Winger, right? In fact, I think there's a Metallica video where they're like throwing darts at Kip Winger. Now, Metallica is a very popular band, but even then, as soon as Metallica started to get very popular, the bigger metalheads were like, Metallica's a bunch of wusses, and they cut their hair, and they called them the Boy Scouts, Alternica, stuff like that, right? So once a band achieves a lot of commercial popularity, then it's almost like they can't be part of the subculture anymore. Maybe the only, I guess, counterexample I can think of would be something like either Iron Maiden or Pantera, either an older band or a band that somehow was really popular while being really hard. That was Pantera. But you have that recapture that happens in the 90s. We're going to do death metal, black metal, we're going to do hardcore metal. We're going to make the vocals incomprehensible. We're going to make them really harsh. We're going to make it so casual listeners cannot understand what this music is about. Complex, dissonant riffs. We're going to make things atonal. We're going to move into weird modal directions. We're going to have 40 different riffs in a song. We're going to have key changes and tempo changes. Everything's going to be complex. That's what you start to get in the 1990s. Or you have prog metal, like with Dream Theater or Symphony X. That is also a little bit hostile to outsiders. Dream Theater is harsher than Yes. Yes tends to be a little bit outsider friendly, maybe not the early records, but certainly the more commercial stuff. Whereas like Dream Theater is more prog metal when you get to that style, and it becomes more inwardly focused, and it becomes more about the casuals are not going to understand this. It's too complex, it's too wild, it's too hard, for you to understand. So metal's a great example of this happening. And so what happens at phase 5, and this happened with jazz, was you have an isolation of the style, of the scene, of the culture that is creating that music. So the isolation of jazz really starts to happen in the 70s and 80s, where jazz just is no longer part of mainstream music. It created a lot of the language that mainstream music used in the 60s and 70s, but it just didn't really stick around. It wasn't the dominant force, and it became less and less popular. When you look at Miles Davis in the 80s, where I gave this, this little quote, Miles Davis was really trying to make jazz continue to be relevant. He would play Cyndi Lauper tunes as standards. He's like, there's no reason these can't be standards. They're tunes people like. We'll take those tunes, we'll improvise on them, we'll play with them, we'll be creative with them. Why not use those as standards? And a lot of people hate Miles Davis music from the 80s. And personally, I'm not a big fan of it, not because it's too out there or it's using pop stuff. There's a lot of good things I think to like about Miles Davis's music post 1970, but just because I feel like Miles was not as good a player then as he was earlier in his career. And that's, you can of course like contest me down in the comments. It's just, it wasn't as good. Like it just wasn't as well put together as it was in previous periods. But I appreciate what he was saying there, and I understand that. So once it gets isolated, it becomes a thing that's almost permanently away from the mainstream. That's kind of where metal is now, is that it's not a top 40 thing, right? It's not top of Spotify. It's its own little subculture with little subcultures and little sub-styles inside of it. I remember in the 2000s, people were naming new like subgenres every other week. It's like, this is like summer black metal. This is blackened death metal. This is blackened power metal. This is blackened doom metal. This is blackened doom death metal. This is, we just came up with so many labels to try to attach to styles. As soon as somebody did something a little bit original or slightly synthesized two different things, it was like a new style. This is flamenco metal or whatever, right? So at that point, it's pretty isolated. Its pure form has been distilled. The normies have been kept out, and it's no longer culturally relevant. And the sixth phase, which I don't know if metal will ever get here, it almost is there, is the preservation phase. And this is where basically you start teaching it in universities. Once a thing is taught at the universities, then you're talking about a preserved cultural product that exists for preservationist and historical reasons, the same way that you care about preserving romantic era brush techniques, the same way that you care about maybe preserving techniques from the post-impressionist period. It's no longer a living thing that people are doing. They're doing it in a sense to preserve and understand what came before. And in the case of jazz, it's it's like many other cultural products, like folk dancing, right? It's something that's preserved so that we remember this important cultural product, not so that we expand on that cultural product, not so that we push the boundaries of that cultural product. And indeed, I noticed this in jazz, is that anytime somebody wants to do something that is a little bit outside of the box, there's a lot of pushback. And it was a really common belief even 20 years ago that there's this pure form of jazz that like guys like Wynton Marsalis would play. And Wynton Marsalis is a preservationist, and he played, quote, preservationist jazz, but every style of jazz was very preservationist. And me and a couple friends I had, we wanted to like do new and interesting things with jazz. We're like, why not push the boundaries? We'll have this and that in it. We'll do like some metal sounds. We'll do some like grind, right? We'll do crazy stuff in jazz. We'll do acid jazz. We'll do whatever. And it was just, no jazz musicians were interested in that. They wanted to play, they wanted to play, if they were into big band stuff, they might be into newer big band stuff like, Gordon Goodwin or something, but they were just not interested in doing new and interesting things with the style, pushing boundaries or being original. They wanted to play what came before. And if you've seen the movie Whiplash, I thought for sure the movie Whiplash was based on a jazz band director I had, as an undergraduate, but it wasn't. It's just a common experience, I guess, to have jazz band directors that are like that, where it's all about doing things in a precise way. And it's like jazz band boot camp, when the jazz musicians that these people listen to never approach jazz like that, right? It wasn't like it was about, the moment and the expression and all these other things that go into making the music. It wasn't about, being this, like going to jazz band competitions. There's jazz band competitions, which is weird. But once it gets to be completely, isolated, completely preserved, then yeah, you can have competitions. You have competitions to see who can play the cleanest, tightest jazz with the best rhythm and miss the fewest notes and the best dynamics and the best solos, maybe, right? I mean, at that point, you might as well play canned solos. And actually, metal is going back and drawing from metal a little bit, is you have a really good example of what I'm talking about in what solos are in metal. Solos are improvised. They come out of the jazz tradition. And if you listen to older players like, Tony Iommi or, any of the players from, like Richie Blackmore, any players from the 70s, they improvise a lot. Their solos are improvised. And I remember going to see Black Sabbath and Tony Iommi was shredding and just improvising, right? And same thing with Yngwie Malmsteen, improvises nonstop. Oh, that didn't sound like the record. Like people around me are upset because they don't go to a lot of concerts. They don't listen to a lot of blues. They don't know that it's supposed to be improvised. They want canned solos. And canned solos were a thing in jazz. Canned solos were what people did in the 40s. There were a lot of bands like that would do canned solos in the 40s. They would play the same solo every night. They just play it note for note. There was no improvisation. And it was because people heard a record. Remember, the recording industry really started to grow in the 20s in jazz. They wanted to hear that solo. And it just became a thing, playing canned solos. So now in metal, virtually all the solos are canned. Very few artists still improvise their solos. Even big name, top of the heap guitarists that you think, oh, these guys are on top of it. They still play canned solos. They play the note for note the thing off the record. They don't do any improvisation. So that tradition is completely abandoned, completely lost, and the audience wouldn't even understand it if you tried to do it. And at that point, I think you've got a real problem with the evolution of the genre. It misses its roots, but it also becomes so isolated that it just can't really progress anywhere. So anyway, those are the 6 phases. And I think jazz is just a good example, but I talk about metal. I think you can look at punk kind of in the same way. Punk became this thing where punks became about being punks, and became kind of the most unpunk thing I can imagine, like where NoFX got kicked off of their own festival for saying the wrong thing at a concert. They said something offensive at a concert, and then they lost their ability to perform at their own festival, right? That's the least punk thing I've ever heard in my life. I see that Michael Graves, he was a singer for the Misfits, he's like getting his concert dates canceled all over America right now because of his politics. Very punk. You said the wrong thing. You said something that offends me. You don't get to perform. It's dangerous for you to perform. Right? Well, but that is very different from how punk was in the 1980s, for sure, where it was about being offensive and kind of sticking it to people. And, where like Black Flag would go out and break windows or whatever after a show. I actually don't know if they ever did that, but there were punk bands that would do stuff like that. So anyway, just to recap, phase 1, birth; phase 2, growth. With jazz, that was the 1920s with the recording industry. Phase 3, popularity. Phase 4, recapture. That's where the fanatics recapture the style from the bigger, from the larger culture. Number 5, isolation. It's where the larger culture just moves on. And then phase 6, preservation, is where it starts to be taught at universities and becomes a remembered cultural product rather than something that can be innovated upon. The only way you can innovate upon it is to call it something that isn't that, right? Like I could call my music jazz, but it wouldn't make sense, even though it's very jazz influenced and I use a lot of jazz things in it. But someone who likes jazz would be like, that's not jazz. It doesn't conform to the preservationist idea of jazz. So you can't really progress it any further at that point. So leave me your thoughts down below. I'd love to read them about the death of jazz or these 6 phases that I talked about. You can get my latest book as part of the Kickstarter. You can get a signed copy, and it's a big, fat, jacketed hardback. Special edition. You won't be able to get this type of hardback after the Kickstarter, by the way. Or if you want to order one without it being signed, that's available as well, as is an ebook if you are the kind that just likes to have an ebook. Though I will tell you, just as an aside, the ability to sideload books on your Kindle devices is going to go away or become significantly more difficult. I'll do a separate video on that, but I just thought I'd warn people, if you're really wanting to collect Amazon books on your Amazon Kindle device, buying them through third parties may not be the best. It may not be like an ongoing option for you, but we'll talk about it more in another video. Leave me your thoughts down below, and I would love to read them, and I'll see you all next time.